Hey Mike, how's it going?
Hey, good. How you doing?
Yeah, good. How was
Good.
you were in uh Spain, right?
Right. Yep. Yeah, I went to KeepCon in Valencia. It was nice. Yeah. I would say the travel is a pain,
Right.
which probably is expected. Um, the event was pretty good, but I would say that the real value was just meeting with a bunch of people out there, sometimes for the first time. So
Oh, right.
from
Okay, cool. Yeah,
from that,
it's annoying. I was kind of half thinking of going, but just yeah, stuff came up at the last minute. But yeah, and then maybe I'd kind of like to go to Detroit as well. So
that
yeah,
one I think will be awesome. So we'll be able to definitely, especially because we have an office there, we'll be able to schedule a lot more easily, I would say. That was kind of one of the challenges with KubeCon EU is it was hard to work with like the event coordinators to figure out like where we could meet and things. It ended up not really being that big a deal once we got on site and saw what the facilities look like. But I was thinking we may need to book like a meeting room, and there was no chance. Like no one
right,
was getting
right, yeah,
back to us. So
yeah.
yeah. But no, it was all good. I'll try to provide a quick update today on some of the stuff we talked about. We do need a volunteer to be a scribe. Ben, would you be willing to do that this morning?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Thanks.
Let me set that up.
All right. One sec. Kick it off in just a few minutes. I guess in the meantime, for the next community meeting, is there any volunteers to be the scribe for that one?
Yeah, I can take care of that next time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. All right. One second. Kick it off. Cool. All right. Just pull up our notes here. Perfect. So yeah, Ben, thanks for volunteering to be the scribe today, or voluntold, whatever way you want to look at it. So cool. It looks like we have a couple of newcomers. Go ahead and do quick introductions. Suppose if you're new and comfortable introducing yourself, please go ahead and yeah, unmute and say hi.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Falk. I'm a product specialist here at Dynatrace. I'm interested with helping with the project, and Todd was nice enough to send me a link for today. So nice to meet you all.
Perfect. Welcome.
Hey everyone, I'm Dominic. I am part of Canonical as an engineering manager. I met some of you in KubeCon, and yeah, just wanted to join the meeting and see what's happening here.
Perfect. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Vedic. I don't happen to be working anywhere right now. I used to work at a company based out of India called Grofers, where I was heading DevOps for them. And I'm just hanging out, trying to see what this cool group is up to and what's happening in this community.
Perfect. Thanks. Welcome.
Hey, I'm Mark Phelps. Currently a software engineer at GitHub, but I also created Flipped, which is a self-contained feature flag solution, on-prem solution, Flip.io. So yeah, just trying to keep abreast of what's going on.
Perfect. Welcome. Thanks. Well, I think that might be it. So appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. We talked about the roles for the next meeting, so I think we should be good to go there. I guess I'll just kick it off real quick. Just say thanks, everyone, for the help with the press release. Went out last week. Seemed to go over pretty well. And so I think that's also probably part of the reason why we have some extra attendees today, which is really exciting. So yeah, appreciate the help. Thanks for getting the word out there. Now comes the hard part, I suppose, is really bringing all this to life and making sure that it's a success. Next, real quick update. We did update the website. Actually called in a favor from a friend. He worked on it. It is written in React. If anyone wants to take a look at it, contribute. For anyone on this call, if you want a kind of a fun little Easter egg in the top left corner, the little OpenFeature logo, the O toggles, only on desktop though. But if you want to be in the know there, it's kind of a fun little Easter egg on the page.
I was on a sales call and I sent the company I was talking to the link, and they found that straight away and really liked it. So that was fun. Yeah, because I didn't know it did that.
Yeah, so it actually goes off your browser preference, so the dark and light mode, and then you can toggle it in the top left corner. So it's a little hidden, but it's kind of a fun little Easter egg in there. Also wanted to I have no affiliation with Netlify, but a quick shout out to them. I registered for the open source license there. Within like a day, they gave it to us, so we're good to go there. Really painless process and pretty slick, actually. I really enjoyed using the tool. So yeah, shout out to them for that. Next thing was the logo. So part of the rebranding was just like the logo. I think most people seem to really like the horizontal one. I think it actually is kind of cool and a little fun play on toggles. The more horizontal one and the little fave icon one could potentially use some work. It's currently, you can find it in the community repo if you're curious to see where all of these assets are. But if you have any recommendations for how we can maybe make a more horizontal logo or a smaller like fave icon work a little bit better, certainly let me know. It would be maybe great to address that at some point, but we just needed to get something out there before press releases and stuff came out. So that's why that's there. There's also a Figma file too. So I'm certainly no designer, but I was trying to do different aspect ratios and backgrounds and things like that, and keep that tracked inside Figma. So if you want to go in there, you can play around with the vector versions of it and then export whatever you need. Cool. Next thing was the roadmap. So especially as the project gets larger and larger, it becomes more difficult to track what everyone's working on. So I took a first crack at updating the roadmap in GitHub. I'm using the new beta projects. And if you go to the roadmap right now, you'll see that the first tab is actually related to the spec only. And it's basically taking a crack at what we're currently working on and a couple proposals for what we could be working on. I think what we have currently in progress would be sufficient for the alpha release that we had talked about, but I'm certainly willing to hear arguments for some of the other features, or if some of the other features that are proposed, or if I'm missing features that should be in the spec, it would be a great time to propose it and just go ahead and throw that in the to do column, and we can talk about what the priority should be there. Cool. Yep. Exactly. So feedback on this would be really appreciated. It's a pretty straightforward tool, but there seems to be a number of ways to kind of do this in GitHub. and it seems to be kind of maturing over time. It's relatively new. It's still labeled as beta. So if you have any feedback on what would work better, certainly let me know. Next on my roadmap would be to add one for research, so we can know what kind of research is currently in flight. And we did create a dedicated repo for research, and I started migrating some of our research out of like the spec repo and stuff into the research repo itself. And if there's any other research topics, feel free to just open up issues in that repo so we can basically track all of our research in there. And if there's any tangible outcome to that research, it'd be great to just merge that in as a markdown in that repo, just so we have the history of it. I'll also be working on an SDK board in the projects, just so we can track which SDKs are currently in flight, which ones have been committed to but haven't started, and which ones are basically out of scope right now. It doesn't mean that we couldn't work on it. If someone is willing to take a crack at one of these languages, that would be great. But I think we just can be a little bit more transparent about what's currently being worked on versus which ones haven't even been started yet. So look for that in the next couple of days. But that's what I'm going to try to spend some time in terms of project planning. Take a quick break there. Is there any questions or feedback on any of what we just talked about there? Cool. All right. I'll just do a real quick update on KubeCon. The first one is related to OTel. So there was, actually, I forgot to add this as a bullet point, but talk to the team about the semantic convention pull request that I had opened a week or two ago. There was actually some questions about that, and it makes sense in retrospect, but just because people gave like the thumbs up emoji, they have no idea like who you are and where that came from. So actually a more valuable way of displaying your support, I suppose, would be to add a comment and say like who you are and what company you represent. And basically that way we can make sure that this is like an industry thing. It's not just like the OpenFeature project pushing what feature flags look like in a trace. If you have any questions about that, either read the issue itself or just ask in the Slack channel. And I can try to update the issue to be more clear of what the value of this would be. But that'd be something that would really be nice to get your support there so we can push it through. Partially because we also, and you can see it in this is linked in the notes here, but OpenTelemetry is working on a demo application right now. It looks like a pretty cool project where it's going to span multiple microservices of multiple technologies. They're actually going to roll their own extremely basic feature flag system into that. As soon as we're ready, it sounds like they're willing to switch that to OpenFeature, which then could be a really nice like kind of joint collaboration here and a cool way to show off feature flagging in a pretty complex architecture and tie it into OTel. So it's a potentially a really cool opportunity for us. They're actively working on it right now, and they're just going to roll with their own simple feature flagging system for now. But it does sound like they're interested. In fact, they were actually the ones that wrote it in their community notes that they were interested in working with OpenFeature. It's just the timelines don't quite work out at this point, but we'll circle back and try to make that happen. The last topic around OTel was context propagation. We did talk to the team there as well. I think there's more to come. It's something that they find extremely interesting as well. So that's more of a teaser. I did create an issue on the project related to that as a way to track it. I don't think it's related to the current spec. It really is kind of out of scope at this point, but I do think that's something that we could certainly tap into, beta or slightly later, which would really unlock some interesting, possibilities going forward. So more to come on that one. It's more of a kind of a teaser and say that we found the right contacts on the OpenTelemetry team to make that happen. And they seem to be actually extremely excited about that possibility because when they built the context propagation, like cross-service technology, they were hoping that it would be used in other projects besides OTel. And currently that's not the case. So it seems like a good, kind of joint partnership there.
Mike, it just occurred to me,
yep.
I'm not sure if we're recording. It looks like maybe we're not.
It is, it's recording.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think it records automatically. So I think we're good to go.
Perfect.
Thanks. And then the last one was the cloud provider. So this is where I can kind of hand it off in just a few minutes to Alex and Todd. But we've been talking about that quite a bit. And I try to clean up some of the language on some of the site where we're not talking about like, cloud native feature flagging and things like that, because it definitely is confusing. We were trying to be more a feature flagging spec is kind of the goal behind OpenTelemetry or OpenFeature releasing this SDKs as well. We also wanted to provide a cloud native like implementation that would allow people to test these concepts out really easily. It gives us something to talk about at conferences like KubeCon and things like that. It also, in the right situation, it could be like a perfect technology fit for companies as well. And we also had talked about at KubeCon potentially tying that back into kind of the vendor ecosystem as well, and how you could potentially just start moving evaluation logic into like this, sidecar process. And I'll let Alex kind of talk about that in just a second, but I just wanted to give a quick teaser about what that was all about. You may start seeing the word flag D as well. It's kind of maybe a working title at the moment, but I think it's kind of maybe a fun name for this cloud native provider that we were working on. So that's it for me. Is there any questions about that before I hand it off to Alex? Okay. Alex, Todd, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Todd, I don't know if you want to go first. I can do like a little screen share if that helps. Do anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'm really excited for FlagD as a concept. Like Mike said, I think it opens up a lot of interesting opportunities to kind of move flag evaluation out of the actual process of the application that's doing flag evaluation. And I think this is like it's just a really exciting architecture. So go ahead, show us your demo.
Sure. So let me just spend 2 minutes. Firstly, I'm going to share my screen. It's on a desktop. So if you're running on a laptop, this might look a little small to you. So I apologize. I hope for most of you this is viewable. So I've increased my terminal size. On the right of my screen, I have the OpenFeature research repository where we have an issue open for how a cloud native architecture would look. Behind this, I have VS Code, which is open on a project called OpenFeature Operator, which is again, like one of the working titles for the Kubernetes native operator. The idea, as Michael was saying, is to provide some sort of practical implementation so that we could test an incoming spec against the schema and actually apply it into some context where users could actually do something with it. So I'm just going to talk through this and take about 60 seconds, and I'll talk through some of the components, and I'll show you it because it's completed in a very initial pre-alpha phase. So what really happens here is if I have a pod entering a cluster through the admission gate, that hits the API server, which then in turn hits this mutating admission webhook in Kubernetes. What that does is it says, hey, you're part of the OpenFeature club. Do you want to have a sidecar injected into you? That sidecar, what's interesting about it is that it's also FlagD. So FlagD can run systemd in a sidecar on an edge device through on sort of ARM HF or ARM64, AMD64. It doesn't matter where it runs, it's just a binary. But that can run in this particular scenario as a sidecar. What it does is that it does a couple of things. It checks to see if you have a flag, a feature flag custom resource set up. And if you do, it will synthesize the flags of that resource into a config map and mount those against the sidecar. It has a hot reloading system as well, and the sidecar is able to then read those flags. So that sounds pretty simple, and it doesn't sound like there's much secret sauce there, right? Because all it's doing is reading a config map. If you actually look at how FlagD works, and I'll open it up here, FlagD is an implementation that I'll show you on the screen here that affects, oh, it's a little bit big. I'll show it a bit smaller. It's an implementation that allows you to have interfaces between services and syncs. So your services are going to be the ways you present your feature flags to users, and the syncs are the way that you pull them in. So think about like file system as a simple sync and HTTP as a simple service. The gap that I think there was prior to this is that there was no way to do IPC traffic across process boundaries. Feature flags have traditionally been HTTP protocol based and are just using JSON objects, whereas this allows us to write a WASM-based service implementation or a gRPC-based protocol implementation. So FlagD has a simple set of Golang-based interfaces that you can extend to write whatever implementation you so choose to put inside of there. And you can check this out, and you can see I've done a very, very, very simple implementation of HTTP. This is interesting because this is what goes into that sidecar. At the moment, when you start that sidecar, it starts with a bunch of default options, but it will start serving from that config map. What's also really exciting about this is you can pull from a remote vendor. So if you want to say, hey, I don't have a local flag configuration, but I do have the definition of where my vendor is, then you can do that too. So let's talk about like a little demo here. So first and foremost, we talked about this CRD. What do flags look like? Well, it could look like a bit like this. So it could look like that, right? We've got a simple JSON object. Doesn't really matter to me what it is. Or you could define a remote vendor spec like this. Now, this would also tell FlagD to go off and get that remote vendor. And this is something that we're working on just fleshing out right now. So let's pretend I've got my local feature flag spec, and I'll just jump into my cluster here where I've got that CR available on my left of my screen. Let me know if you can't see anything. So it's not there at the moment. So I'm just going to go give control apply config samples and just put that into the cluster. So now I have that feature sample with my feature flag spec, which is my JSON object string. Then what I need to do is I need to actually say, hey, I want to use that. So what I've got is a very simple pod. This is off the shelf, right? It's just an Nginx container inside of this pod. Now, what I've got are some annotation gates. I've linked it to the feature flag configuration sample, and I've set that it's enabled. I thought this was a nice thing to add, but we can talk about the semantics later on. So now I go Q-control, apply, examples, pod. So what this does is this hits the mutating admission webhook in this controller manager, and it then injects into Nginx. You'll see now that Nginx has 2 containers inside of this pod. You'll also see that the webhook has been hit on the mutate of the v1 of the pod. If we go up now into config maps, we'll also see that we have a default config that's been created. We could also talk about making this a secret. Like, this is very early days. We can change all of this stuff later on. It could be a secret as well. So in Nginx, we want to jump into this and say, well, what's going on here? I'm just going to go quickly and apt update and grab curl, because for whatever reason, they decided to let you get apt tools inside of this container, which is useful for me. Once I've got curl, I mentioned that I wrote the HTTP interface for this. So I'm going to go off and do a really simple localhost. And what we'll see is I go curl localhost 8080, I've got foobar. This is exciting because if I have a C-based application in this container, I can also hit an interprocess socket, right? So I could set my AF Unix socket to be the thing that I deal with. And so this actually means that now the feature flag system is extensible to any protocol that we can create a serverless implementation for. So there are 2 separate components here. We have flag-D, which is the injected sidecar, and also potentially the binary that does the serving. And we have the OpenFeature operator, which is the delivery system for Kubernetes. I'll stop there because I've talked about quite a lot of stuff. Any questions so far?
Just a point of clarification. I think you mentioned two kind of extensibility interfaces. So I think you call them sinks and services. So just to make sure I understand and getting the verbiage correct, the service is basically the integration point that our cloud native SDK would interface with to communicate with the sidecar. It could be, it's HTTP in this case, but it could be any kind of, it could be the AF Unix socket, like you said. It could be maybe something a little bit more robust and well-defined, like some kind of protobuf protocol, maybe gRPC, something like that. And then the sinks, those are how you would communicate with hypothetically any kind of feature flag control plane, as it were. So in this case, again, we're talking about a mounted config map, but it could be launched darkly, or it could be a flagsmith, or it could be any connection to a vendor. So it could be basically wrapping their, maybe even using OpenFeature to wrap their SDK and get information from their API indirectly. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a super concise way of putting it. I was just looking to see if I had an image that showed it. I don't. I think it's here actually. So yeah, one of the core concepts that isn't in the example, so you won't find this if you play around with this yet. But one of the core concepts is that the feature operator can read within the YAML file this remote endpoint object, and what it understands then is that when it starts the agent inside the container, the agent knows not to use the local path, but it will actually use a remote endpoint. There is definitely work to be done around making sure that this is secure. We can buffer and we can reset and all those sorts of things. But yeah, fundamentally, it then would have a secret that also is mounted with your remote config and credentials, and go off and fetch directly into that config map. So it supports multi-vendor. As long as the vendors are using the same API spec for your fetch, then it will work. And actually, just to extend that, we don't even need to do that. We can have differing interfaces per vendor, right? So if you have a remote endpoint, we can set a type on it rather than it being HTTP. If you're a vendor that only does certain protocols, then we can also support that as well, just by the sheer fact that the flag-D system is fairly simple to extend.
Well, what we could probably do, I imagine, is actually embed the OpenFeature Go SDK in here, which would wrap whatever vendor SDKs are available in Go. So that could be another way to kind of abstract that, and we can massage that data exactly how we need to present it to the
Yeah, I think that's a really nice idea, is that we could, as you say, have the interface to the vendor SDKs directly inside of FlagD. The thing that, as we were saying earlier on, the thing that FlagD isn't is it's not Kubernetes native, right? It should be completely agnostic. If you look at the modules that are actually used in here, it's all vanilla Golang, right? And that's kind of the point, is that it can be compiled to as many different architectures as possible.
So I have a question just kind of more for OpenFeature overall. Is this kind of implementation expected to be like the official OpenFeature Kubernetes implementation? I'm trying to understand, what parts are spec, and then what parts is OpenFeature we're going to say this is the cloud native route?
Yeah, that's a good question. That was going to be I guess my next point too. So there's a couple things going on here. I would say what we're talking about here would be like a spec compliant provider that we're tentatively calling FlagD. That's I guess how I would answer that one. So this wouldn't necessarily be built into the OpenFeature spec per se. It would just be compliant with the spec. But we did want to make sure that we had in the hooks potentially for, if vendors wanted to, you could kind of move down into this sidecar process as well, if that would make sense in certain architectures and situations. So that was part of the idea there. I think we'll probably try to go with that name to make that distinction. The only question really would be, keeping it in the same org, as long as we're clear about, the messaging and what this means. Is that okay, or is that confusing? It'd be kind of nice to keep it in the same place, in my opinion, but I could definitely see, the argument, for potentially moving it. I think for now we'll have it in there, but we'll have to just make sure that it's very clear that this is a, OpenFeature spec compliant provider, and then kind of we can make adjustments from there. The other part would be, it likely makes sense to break this topic off into like a dedicated like special interest group. And so we can kind of not clutter this meeting with like kind of going technically into this provider, since we'll just follow the, OpenFeature spec. So that's something that if ever, people are on board with that, I'll just send out, like a doodle in the Slack channel just to get people's availability, and we can try to schedule that maybe on the off week or something like that. And that could be a more technical deep dive in what we're hoping to achieve there and where the different integration points could be and everything.
Yeah, and just to maybe like put things another way, I agree with everything Mike said. To put things another way, I think we can think of FlagD as as basically just moving the abstraction up the stack, right? So it's really the same kind of abstraction, and ideally, I think we could even use the OpenFeature Golang SDK, like we were talking about in FlagD, as that kind of abstraction layer to various vendors. But essentially, instead of having your adapter to any vendor or flag management system within your running application, we're just moving that out into a separate process, and one with some cloud native integrations. I mean, like Alex said, we really don't even particularly need to involve Kubernetes in FlagD itself. Kubernetes is just the particular deployment mechanism that we know is going to be relevant for cloud native architectures. But FlagD could run as a systemd service. It could run really anywhere, because it's a separate process. But we're essentially moving that abstraction, where we're doing the abstraction to the feature flag control plane, out of process into a separate process, but potentially using the exact same mechanisms and even using the OpenFeature Golang SDK.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, just to kind of hammer it home though, the spec itself won't really be affected by this. We'll want to make sure that the spec like supports these use cases, within reason, but it's not like, we're not like going to update the spec and kind of pollute it with this type of information. So that's one of the goals.
I think I was more wondering, like, from OpenFeature, is it, as a organization or group, are we going to say this is kind of the suggested route for Kubernetes? Just understanding that aspect of it more so.
So I might be able to take this. So I was a little bit involved with some of the early OTel work, and I think the pattern that works really well is when you you create a reference architecture, but you're very you're very elastic, right? Because there'll be suggestions that come in. And I think the thing is that sometimes it can be death by committee. So we build a general reference architecture that has components that can be individually improved. That makes it a lot more easy for people to come in and try and incrementally improve things, rather than us sort of having no opinion and the project going nowhere on the cloud native side. In terms of ratifying and making sure that this is a good design, we've gone through a couple of rounds, and actually this is totally why we need that working group. We might want to throw this out and say, oh no, we're going with a message bus approach or whatever, but I have fairly high confidence that we've had a few passes on this, and this is sort of the K8s native architecture that is actually very idiomatic for native Kubernetes. So we're not really building any components that are off the wall or unusual. We're working completely with K8s rather than going upstream against it.
All right, perfect. Yeah. So I guess look for the message in the Slack channel. I think we'll try to decouple it. I think it does make sense, especially because those other meetings could be more technically focused as we kind of move forward with that. But definitely, if you're interested, feel free to join that. Cool. Looks like Todd's up next. Todd, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so the thing I really wanted to mention, and I should, I guess, apologize for some amount of thrashing on this. There's been a PR open in the spec repository for a while now for evaluation context. And it's obviously an important topic. It's something that just about every vendor, every SDK is concerned with, defining attributes for the basis of dynamic flag evaluation. So really what I wanted to kind of talk about in this meeting, there was a lot of back and forth in terms of how well we wanted to define whether or not we wanted to kind of rigorously predefine certain fields in the context. So for example, IP, timestamp, the email address of the subject of the flag evaluation, these sorts of things. And I felt pretty strongly that we did want to do that. And my main reason for that was because what I wanted to avoid was contracts between the application author, person doing feature flag evaluation, and the provider. Because the provider is supposed to be something that we're able to change. We don't want to have too many contracts between the application author and the provider, because essentially it brings back lack of portability, right? So it causes lack of portability. We really want to have the provider just be something that's configured once, and then the application author doesn't have to think about it. So whether that's the cloud native provider, like we just talked about, or Launch Darkly, or Flagsmith, we really just want to kind of set that and forget it. And so my concern was if different providers had different concepts of what to call these particular attributes, where within the context they might be found, the particular format of these attributes, in terms of like how they're serialized or whatever, that if we didn't define that, then it would cause a kind of an explosion of these sorts of contracts where you would have to know, like, okay, if I am using the provider X expects the IP in this particular field of the context. And that was really based off of a concern that some providers did define particular attributes kind of as first-class predefined attributes. And what I think continuing research has found is that providers which have done that, vendors which have done that, actually seem to kind of regret that decision. It seems that kind of predefining particular attributes only gets you into trouble later. One of the things it does is almost encourage people to fill them all out by default, which can result in a lot of PII kind of just unnecessarily being added to the library and fired into the feature flagging system when it wasn't really necessary because nobody was writing rules against them, actually. So that's one downside that I've heard. So anyway, all that to say is after a lot of thrashing and back and forth, I've since moved away from the idea that we should kind of propose a bunch of predefined attributes to the fact that maybe we should just provide a context with some semantics around it. Perhaps later we'll talk about propagation, but just with here's kind of what we expect to be in the context, what we expect it to be used for. Here are the types that we expect to be able to populate in the context. We support nested objects versus, we don't, those types of things. But I think I would probably want to propose that we get away from rigorously defining particular fields. That's kind of where I've landed. I don't know if anybody has feedback on that. I think maybe Dan, you did, but that was.
Yeah.
Sorry, like real quick though, there was one, I think exception to that was the targeting key, correct?
Yeah.
So we needed to have one that represented like the user or whatever. And user, I don't think is the right terminology here because it doesn't have to be a user, but we needed something. So targeting key, I think, was the one exception to that. But correct me if I'm wrong, right, Todd?
Well, currently that's the way it is in the spec, but I'm interested to hear objections, input from anyone else.
I know.
Yeah, just to chime in here, I think having a goal of being able to, seamlessly swap from one vendor to the next is something that is important as a goal, but I feel it's possibly never going to happen, in that it's just the implementations, the rules, just the finer detail of how these engines are different means that you're almost, without a spec like this, it's impossible to have something that's literally put a different provider's package name in and away you go kind of thing. I do think it's a good thing to strive for, but I do agree with you, Todd, that I feel like providing some sort of identity key, I mean, that's something, as far as I understand, that exists across all vendors. But after that, you're immediately into different, quite major differences in implementation that mean that you're unavoidably going to have lock-in at some point.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here. From what we've seen historically at launch directly too is we had those fields, but you can almost consider them legacy. I don't even know how long ago they're added before I've been here. And like you're saying, Todd, people just fill them out at times and then they come back later on and they're like, hey, I sent you PII that I didn't want to. So up front, I feel like we should probably have as small of an API service for those being defined. And if we see down the line that, actually with using OpenFeature, 90% of everyone is asking for this field, we can add it in there versus trying to deprecate it in the future, which is always tougher.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. The other thing that Todd and I were talking about, and like to get everyone's thoughts on this, is we could say, if you're looking for like a naming convention, perhaps look at like the elastic comma schema or something like that first. We wouldn't want to include that as a dependency. It's actually quite large, but that might be something to keep in mind for like a naming convention for certain context property names.
Yeah, and I think generally, like Mike kind of teased earlier, and I was hoping to get a larger discussion on perhaps offline. I mean, it does come in the PR, but like Mike mentioned, I do think probably we do need to define a targeting key. Just about, I think actually every single vendor we've looked at does require a targeting key. So something to identify the subject of the flag evaluation. I say subject because it may be an actual user, it may be a service, but I think universally the concept exists in every vendor. The only thing that is a little bit tricky is some vendors require it and some don't. I believe that we're going with not requiring it because we don't require context at all for the most basic cases. But that presents some amount of difficulty in feature flag vendors that do require a targeting key or some representation of the user. And it might just be in some vendors' cases. I think that particularly with Flagsmith, they come to mind. The targeting key is only needed if you want to do attribute-based evaluation, but if you don't, then you don't need it. And so there's kinds of all different levels of requirement around the targeting key. So we'll have to be careful with how we implement that. I do have a proposal for that in the spec currently, but I bring all this up because I'd like to get this closed sooner than later. So it sounds like we have some amount of consensus But yeah, feel free to take a look at the PR if you haven't yet.
Yeah, I definitely want to follow up on the targeting key because I know from like LaunchRT side, it has implications. And I think someone from Split mentioned the same for them. One for randomization, but two also for the events we generate. If people implement that wrong, it can have effect down the line of like how many events they're sending and what that affects. So it's a pretty important piece.
Yeah,
so-
and
Yeah, so one of the things that we were talking about here is if we make it optional, because I don't think we'd want to have to pass this in at flag evaluation time. I think that'd be actually a bummer if we had to do that. I'd prefer to be able to do that upstream somewhere, maybe even during like, client creation or somewhere up, where that like targeting information is more readily available. And that's part of the challenge too. So like, you could basically inject that context in multiple layers. And so perhaps what we would just have to recommend is say like, if a provider needs this, it would have to kind of fail loudly almost in a way, because it'd be pretty trivial to just go in there and add that in at the right layer and then it just works again. So that might be just what we would have to recommend for providers that require this particular context.
yeah, I think that's a good point. So I hear what you're saying, Dan, and I know that Split did have the same concern. So these are basically factors for differential evaluation, whether it's based on rules or based on like percentage rollout, that kind of thing. So we just need to decide, okay, like if we're not going to make it mandatory on the OpenFeature API level, how then do we handle it in providers when it's not defined? Like what would be the recommendation? What would a hypothetical LaunchDarkly provider do? What would a hypothetical Split provider do if it doesn't have a user targeting key? And if that's just too difficult a problem to deal with, I mean, it could just be that it defaults. It could just be that it logs a message and says, hey, you need to provide a targeting key for this provider. I don't know. But if that's too tricky a problem, we may need to think a little bit more about whether or not it does become a required parameter.
And I could see it throwing like a well-known error. We already have errors defined and those would bubble up and like be exported from like the details call anyways. Could also be included in like any kind of logging hooks and stuff. So it'd be pretty obvious, like, flag defaulted because targeting key was undefined or something.
The initial worry I had there, though, is that it's kind of hidden unless you're already wired into OTel or something else. Because we're going to return that default flag value, a new user coming in can be confused, or switching providers. It can provide some confusion there. But we can take this offline and continue talking in the issue.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps that's where like the logger potentially could come into place. Although, of course, like I think that would require the user to like register a logger. I don't think we would just dump logs out. So yeah, let's chat about that because like there's really not a great answer most likely. I'm really kind of anti requiring it at flag evaluation call though. I'd much prefer to be able to pass that information in at a more convenient location. And how we solve that one elegantly is slightly more tricky. Or maybe we just require it at the context level or the client creation level. Potentially could be an option, but I think that may be tricky as well. So
I mean, on a server side, evaluation, that may be a non-starter. I mean, because you don't have the same user with every request, right? So like that doesn't really get you much.
Yeah.
If this is used for a rollout situation.
So I guess the action item there is we should just probably cut an issue specifically for this topic. So I think it's probably slightly unrelated to the evaluation context spec definition, but maybe it's an issue that's more or less linked to that and some of the challenges that having an optional targeting key, basically would lead to. So I can handle that one. I'll create the issue and link it to the pull request, and then I'll just put it in our Slack channel so we can kind of discuss it through GitHub.
Yeah, sounds good.
Cool. I have a couple Java SDK updates. We're kind of targeting in on having it be pretty well formed. I think the biggest missing piece at the moment is support for objects. eBay in particular is probably going to put this into production in early Q3, assuming I can find time to do some work. So that's exciting. One of the things that I hear folks talking about is internally is wanting OpenFeature to be a generalized config fetching mechanism. Like some people, so we have many versions of config internally, like 7. And people are like, I don't want to go check the feature flagging system and then the experimentation system and then the like flat file config system to figure out if this thing's on or not. I just want it to be just no. And so we're thinking about like how we might do aggregate providers. And we should be able to do that by just implementing the right interface and handling it all internally, but that's kind of something I'm noodling on, and precedence ordering and all this other stuff is kind of a sticky wicket. So
that's a really interesting idea, and it's not the first time I've heard it. And you may want to talk to Pete, because Pete specifically brought that up. In fact, he coined the term mega provider. I'm not sure if it was mega provider or meta provider, but it was exactly what you described. So it would be like implementing the provider interface by composing several existing providers together, or at least several other APIs together, maybe even doing some caching to cache where this particular value was resolved last time and looking there again to get the the most recent version. So like I think it's a really interesting idea, and maybe you may want to have an offline chat with Pete, because he's already done some thinking about it.
And just wondering, Justin, is this also, it sounds more like around parameterized code than specifically features, if it's kind of configuration management. So is it also for like general config properties?
So there are some people who want that generalized config, because again, we have many versions of config. But even for features, like whether a feature is on or off is like, 1, this feature flagging thing we're building, 2, like we run experiments through an experimentation platform. And that's another place where on or off could be decided. And then thirdly, like some people, so eBay has many sites like Germany and US, and we may have a config value that we're like, okay, for safety, we want to roll this out as a feature flag, but then later we know it's not going to change all the time. So we're just going to hard code that into like flat file config instead, because of the way we've implemented our feature flagging system. And so for long-lived feature flaggy things, put them in a flat file. And that'll be a faster evaluation.
Okay.
So that that one could be sort of interesting. It's actually, I had started writing out the proposal and then stopped because I actually only found precedence in Split for this, but basically like a bulk feature flag evaluation API. Not sure if that would totally apply here, but potentially would help if you're kind of mapping, kind of trying to almost simulate like a config file or something. So yeah, I'm not sure how important that would be either.
We do have that use case, especially for mobile. So the internal structure of what we have is different than many providers, and we will eventually change to what other providers do, but we offer synchronous API calls for fetching a flag value, and those take, let's say, 10 milliseconds. Instead of shipping the full rule evaluation logic down to the client and having them evaluate locally. And so bulk flag updates is something that will be very keen for a mobile use case that we're kind of looking at.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. That's one of the things that I'm hoping to put on the research planning board, but that's an area that we have not really addressed at all, is client side, both browser and mobile. And really, like, figuring out some of these answers too, because it seems like even across vendors right now, they do like, either the flag configs are synced client side and then evaluated locally, which has certain issues, versus remote flag evaluation, which also has issues. So really, and we sort of need to be kind of unopinionated there, but we'll have to have some kind of SDK that's capable of handling both as elegantly as possible, which may go back to actually the bulk evaluation API, which also brings in some other challenges. So I think the research needs to start as soon as possible so we can start answering those questions, and making sure that some of the spec definitions don't kind of collide with some of the client goals and needs.
I have our mobile architecture team. They're going to be looking at OpenFeature with the notion of, okay, given this spec, what things do we need to do like to make this actually work in mobile? Like, are there problems in the spec from a mobile standpoint? And
yeah,
so
that'd be very helpful.
In the next couple of weeks.
Cool. And I'll hopefully have that issue out there then. If they have any feedback, we can just associate it with that issue, then that'd be helpful.
Just to add, like one of the things that we've sort of come up against using the platform to do like pure config is how, and I think this is for the majority of providers, like we have no authentication against our API for getting flags, right? If you've got the key for the environment, you can get the flags. And so we have people thinking about using the SDK and the platform for storing config values, but then you worry that people might put something that it should be secret into an API that's like anyone can get it, right? Like, and the keys in your web page or your mobile app, and you can trivially get that. So we've kind of shied, and we're not doing like hard proper public key encryption with the data and all this sort of stuff, and it opens this massive can of worms. So we just say to people, like, we're not doing that. Like, if you want to store trivial stuff that you'd be happy to put on a web page, then great, but otherwise we don't want to start dealing with that. And yeah, it's just a massive can of worms.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I don't want to put those things in our feature flagging platform, but I would like users to be able to access it through the same config, like through the same fetching interface.
Yeah, I think that would be good. Yeah, so it's interesting because you could provide an adapter to Vault or something, right?
Yeah, it brings up sort of an interesting point. Definitely the line between feature flagging and almost config management blur. And then even to make it even more complex, like one of the proposals was kind of like event tracking, which is pretty common across at least some vendors. So it's kind of like there's three topics almost there. It's kind of A/B testing, event tracking systems, which you can look at the proposal. I have it marked pretty low in priority right now, and if someone has a strong opinion on that, certainly voice your opinion there. But that's one aspect, and then also kind of the config management / feature flagging is an interesting topic for sure as well. So yeah, I guess Justin, think about that use case a little bit more, and see where maybe some of the gaps are, and if without changing too much of the spec, if there's some way to support this use case better, I think that it likely makes sense. It would just have to make sure to kind of not break core design principles in order to achieve that goal.
Yep.
Cool. Just about out of time. Is there any other topics anyone wanted to discuss? Perfect. Okay.
So just to add, we're close to so our Python implementation is done. It's just waiting for one of the guys to review it, and then yeah, once we've done that, we'd love people to kick the tires on that as well. And one other query I had was like, it's a kind of a tough problem, I think, but has any thought been given into providing some sort of like cross-language test harness that we can see if these things are behaving in the same way given the same provider data?
That's a good question. Actually, I think it was Harness had a really interesting way of doing it. Maybe Dave could slightly talk about it, but it was basically like they had like test cases in a separate repo, and then they would basically mount it in there and then just make sure that the tests kind of pass the specific use cases. I'm not sure if that concept could apply here, but that would be maybe an interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, that's exactly. We had a test case repo that we submodule in to each of our SDKs. It works pretty well for the server side SDKs. It's a bit harder with the client side. We kind of have to load it in through a different way, but effectively the SDKs read in basically rules that they would have otherwise got from the server, as well as flags, and then there's some extra metadata to say like what value you should expect. I think we've played with a few other things like wrapping all the SDKs in an application. Like we like the idea of trying to have a dashboard where you could have like, I don't know, 20 windows, all the different SDKs, and as you toggle a flag, you would see them all change to the same color, or kind of something that's fairly in your face, maybe less automated, but it's kind of quite a visual representation of what's going on. But yeah, for now, that kind of idea of the common test cases works. There's a bit of wrapper code, obviously, that has to go into each SDK, but it's probably something we could do. It's like too much effort.
So really, basically, just you're essentially hosting test cases, which are metadata with like the expectations, and then every SDK more or less just parses that and then runs against it.
That's it, yeah. So we've kind of got, like, if you'd imagine the metadata that would come from the server anyway, if the rules and flags information, it's basically that in a YAML form or a JSON form, and then a little bit of extra data with the expectations tagged on the end. We've got enough that it's working. We kind of thought about, could we formalize it a bit more? We actually break out those expectations, and separate them, because they're really the test cases, and it's kind of, maybe the other parts are more internals.
So that might be just something to kind of explore over the next couple of weeks, and it could be another topic for the next community sync if there's if it's something that people have ideas. I mean, take a look at what Harness has done. It may not apply perfectly to what we're trying to do, but I think the idea is pretty solid actually. And also, I think Justin opened a ticket about taking the spec and then exporting a single JSON file, which is something that I think we should also try to knock out. That may make it even easier to have that single file, and it's more or less a checklist at that point. You just say like, are we, complying to the spec, and you just kind of read right down through the different topics. So I actually started prototyping that, but I'm not super far along yet. So hopefully I can wrap that up in the next few days, and that hopefully makes it a little bit easier to test, where we are in the spec, or where your SDK is, I guess, when it comes to being spec compliant. So cool. Any other topics we should discuss in the last few minutes? Nope. All right, perfect. Well, thanks again, everyone. I think, I guess the theme of the next few weeks will just be trying to get that context resolved probably in the next day or two. So certainly, monitor that as quickly or as closely as possible. And then I think we're getting very close with having it sounds like the Python SDK, the Java SDK, and the Node.js SDK in a state where we can start experimenting with it. The next step will be figuring out how like a contribs repo could work, which is where hooks and various provider wrapping could live, and that's something we'll have to discuss, like how the permission models look, what the release strategy looks like, all of that. So maybe start thinking about how you would like to see that work. It could be maybe a discussion point for the next community sync. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. And then look for that doodle too for the dedicated flag D sig as well. So cool. And thanks, Ben, for being the scribe this week. Appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks, everyone. All right.
Thanks.
Have a good day. Bye.
See ya.